Welcome back to Making Imagination, the podcast that looks at animated filmmaking one craft at a time. I'm Wes. Today, we're looking at adapting animation, and we're doing that with director Tod Polson. Tod was mentored by Chuck Jones' frequent production designer, Maurice Noble, and his book, The Noble Approach, is a masterclass in production design. If you can get your hands on a copy of this book, I highly recommend that, and I do not always highly recommend that kind of thing. Tod's worked on many projects over the years, but in this episode, we'll look at his involvement in The Secret of Kells, a short film called The Prodigal, and in his new Oscar-contending animated short, The 21. Working on The Secret of Kells, I suppose, is technically something of an adaptation in that you're working from the Book of Kells.
Well, the Book of Kells was kind of a source of inspiration for the design style. The history is, it's pretty fictional. They don't know exactly what happened. There is the history of the Vikings, of course, in Ireland. There is the history of the monks preserving. We wouldn't have a lot of what we have with the illuminated manuscripts, especially without the monks. And so they preserved a lot of that. So it was an adaptation, but it was really like, it was a college project, university project for Tom Moore and Nora Twomey and that whole group of people. And so when I met them, they had just gotten out of college. They'd gotten a small grant to start developing the film and adapting it to a feature length. And they'd just gotten some financing from the French government as a co-production. So when I arrived, they'd been working on it probably 4 years at that point, all through their college years. And when I arrived, they just had this mismatch of hundreds of pieces of this amazing art. And they were looking for a background head. That's what I was originally hired to do. And I was like, wow. It's just like, so that's how we got to know each other through that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I was poring over kind of the art of book, which is amazing and fascinating. And I saw just because they were drawing from the Book of Kells for inspiration,
right?
They were able to kind of break some design rules, like use tangent lines and things.
Right. Intentional tangents. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How was approaching that project stylistically, using the Book of Kells as kind of a springboard?
Well, like I say, by the time I had gotten involved with the project, they had sort of set the style. They knew the source material, and Tom especially was really, moved by, I don't know if you've seen any of his comic book work, because that's what Tom really wanted to be, was a comic book artist. And so it's really ornate. It's really beautifully designed. So for me, it was pretty easy stepping in. I can't really take much credit for that. The only thing I had, I had more experience. And so basically my biggest job when I got there was organizing all of this art and then putting it into like a timeline, basically starting a rough color script. And because it was they like gray and brown. So we had this gray and brown film. And when I was working on the color script, I intentionally cranked the colors up way too much. I made them too saturated, knowing that they were going to pull them back anyway. So I don't know if I've ever told them that, but because they were, the art they were doing was beautiful, but it wasn't necessarily backing the emotions. At points, yes, they had very clear vision. And at other points, they were just still trying to figure things out. So
interesting. As you were working on color scripting for that project specifically, were you, I know you talk about in your book, color is something of emotional language. Was that kind of your primary task for the color approach that you had for this film, is sort of filling it with the right emotions and telling that story emotionally?
Yeah, and it was there already. They'd had a pass on the animatic, and so and they'd had some music that they were starting, so it was kind of clear, what emotion was supposed to be where. And so what I did was I just went in and then I took a lot of the art they already had, and then again, tried to crank that up, and I created concept pieces as well that I could kind of plug in some of those gaps. And so it was kind of a gradual process. And then, after my first draft of the color script, what you see on the screen was them taking what I did and then plussing, as the film developed. Ross Stewart, of course, is amazing, amazing designer. And of course, all those guys are just incredible. So again, I just kind of laid the foundation, and they just kind of took it to the next level. They had a great team of young, hungry artists.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you were quoted in the art notebook as just talking about just working with a group of artists who were doing it for love of the craft and not
That's
for
right.
marketing toys and things like that.
It was a very different experience. They were artists who happened to be doing animation, but when they weren't doing animation, again, they were doing, like Ross Stewart. He would be on the west coast of Ireland doing paintings, and Tom would be doing his comic books or all kinds of stuff. You go to the pub on Thursday nights. We go to the pub a lot of times. The band would be playing, and then all of a sudden, people be pulling out flutes and instruments and all kinds of stuff. It's just such a big part of their culture, and such a big change for me, because growing up in Wyoming, we have a little bit of that, but not, they live and breathe this stuff. And Kilkenny, if you've ever been there, is a very, very artsy community. They have lots of ceramics and jewelry making and textiles and traditional crafts. And in the middle of the town, there's instrument shops, musical instrument shops, and it's a medieval city. So it's like it has 6,000 pubs or something. And so at night, as you're walking along, you can hear the music like wafting out into the street. And this is the environment that Tom grew up in, and so it rubs off on his filmmaking. It's really just an extension of himself. And so the challenge for me was adapting that, trying to figure out who Tom was, and then trying to get his vision through my work as well.
Fascinating. So I know you were involved with another project years later, which was an adaptation of a parable from the Gospels, Luke,
Right. Mm-hmm.
Called The Prodigal.
That's right.
And I was curious, when you decide to take on a project like that, what are some considerations that you take into account as you consider adapting a story?
Right. Well, that project, it was something that I had wanted to do for a long time, and The Prodigal especially. But sometimes I needed a kick in the pants. So, working in the industry, I often put my own projects, as we often do, on the side, right? And so a friend of mine, Brett Bosch, he was working in Turkey for many years, and he came to me and said, "Hey, would you like to work on this project together?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've always wanted to do that." So he got a little bit of funding. I don't know, it wasn't much, but it was enough that I could take a little bit of time off and do some sketches and stuff. And again, it was weekends and nights. I was teaching over in Denmark, so I got a group of students to come over one summer. And I was living in Thailand at the time. And so they all came over to Thailand, and we spent the summer creating art, doing cutouts. It's the originally I wanted to do like a cutout film, all cutout, and then we ended up doing kind of a hybrid. But so a lot of the shape language was derived from iconography, from a lot of Turkish art, because we wanted it to feel like it was from that place. that region of the world. So that's kind of where it started.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it has a very unique, quite deliberate look with that kind of cutout style you were talking about. For how do you come to that decision for a project like this? Was it part of the kind of the background of where it's coming from, or what made you say this should look like this should be a
Well,
cutout project?
I think for me anyway, animation works best in the short form. Like some of the best animation you'll see is in commercials and short films. That's the place where you can really do experimentation. I'd always in my bachelor's program, I had done 3 cutout films. And so after some years had passed, I mean, quite a few years, I thought I would really like to try to tackle a cutout film, stop motion. And so with the shorts, since I knew we had no budget, I wanted to do something that looked different enough that when people were scrolling or looking through stuff, they go, "Hey, what's that?" And maybe that would be enough to make someone actually want to watch it. But the fascinating thing about paper to me is that it feels almost like flesh. It's very fragile, you might say. So you can see the light come through the layers of paper, and you can see the textures, and when you put paint on it, it has a certain kind of feel that's very warm, that's again fragile. And so to me, for this story, since it was a very emotional story, I felt that maybe that approach might make it feel more intimate. Some of the experiments worked, and some of them I wish I could redo. They didn't work, but it was sort of a first, with our budget, it was like just with our first pass was basically what we ended up with. So
Yeah.
I don't mean to talk about budget. It's just that when you're designing stuff, you have to consider that. I think it's one of the student film syndrome, right? Where you have these beautiful concept paintings and drawings, but you can't take them to finish because it's just too, it's good to set your goals high. But yeah, it's a difficult balance.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That was something that I underlined from your book, The Noble Approach, or Maurice Noble talked about.
Yeah.
Your job is to make the best film you can within your limitations.
Right.
That includes budget.
Yeah, it's a big part of it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's one reason why sometimes the indie films are a little more interesting sometimes than because you can take chances. You don't have as much to risk necessarily, and you can make it more of a personal statement that can, speak to people, speak to an audience.
Yeah. Interesting. Was there any kind of trepidation at all about interpreting a passage from the Bible, or was that?
It was a really great challenge because you really had to know the story, and not only the story, the context of the story and some of the history and what it would mean in that culture at that time, for example. So for me, I like the challenge of that. And with every every personal film I do, I try to set a particular challenge, something that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull off,
Well.
but somehow it works out for better or worse. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, wow. Wow. So recently, I do want to get into kind of the meat of the conversation. Recently you've directed a short film called The 21,
right.
which gets distributed February. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, the February would be the 10th anniversary of the Martyrs' death when they released ISIS released the film publicly. This film of murder, to 2015. And so this will be the 10th anniversary. We're hoping to be there in Egypt with the families and show it to them first before we release it publicly. So they haven't seen anything for a few years now. The families were involved early on when I was doing my research. I was collecting interviews, talking to them, talking about the message they would like to portray in the film. But they haven't seen anything since. So
Wow.
it'll be really interesting.
Yeah. On the website, the21film.com, there is some kind of talk into the seeds of this project, talking about ISIS put out this video as very kind of a propaganda piece, and you guys really kind of wanting to take that narrative back and tell the side of this story, which is ultimately a victory.
Right. That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about just the inspiration for this particular story?
Well, it had been something that had affected me when they released that. I mean, the whole world remembers this line of men in orange jumpsuits being led down the beach, by ISIS, by these tall ISIS guards. It was surreal. And that affected me deeply. But the thing that really touched me was the family's response to that. So the parents and the wives of the men who died, they, you would expect them to say, "I hope they burn in hell." They didn't. Of course, they were angry, they were hurt, but their response was they wanted these men who had killed their loved ones, these men, to come to know the love of God. And when I went to Egypt and talked to them it was life-changing. Just hearing their stories and hearing their heart. I I broke down right there. And it made me examine my own faith, and what is my motivation for life, really? I mean, that's how deeply it struck me. We were sitting there eating lunch together. These bloodied uniforms, these orange uniforms, were laid out in the next room.
Wow.
And it's like, wow, this is what these guys went through, and they could have given up their faith, but they didn't. And so for me, that was really the catalyst for wanting to tell this story, and especially with everything that's going on in the world. It is specific to this one event, but of course we know that this event has happened many, many times and is still happening so I think even though the message is specific to that, the message really is about forgiveness. It's about love. It's about, those things that are really important, I think, and even more important now with everything that's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. No, as a Christian myself, I am grateful that the film has been made, and I look forward to seeing it.
Great.
This subject matter is especially heavy.
It is. It's not an easy film, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the trailer alone, I think, is there's a moment in the trailer where Jesus opens his eyes, and it's so moving. I'm really moved. What are some considerations when you start to approach a project like this?
Well, the first was how, and it was the most difficult challenge, was how are we going to tell this story? How are we going to tell a story of murder, basically, and carry that message of forgiveness at the same time without glamorizing the violence, without glamorizing, because that was the real balance. You wanted to show how they suffered, what they suffered, And I guess it's the same way with the Passion of the Christ, for example. It's like you don't want to glamorize it, but you also don't want to pull back too much from that because you want people to appreciate the suffering that went into that sacrifice. I mean, it was a choice, and for these men, it was a choice as well to stay true to their faith. Um, they could have been set free, but they chose not to. And the thing that the wives said is they said that ISIS unwittingly had filmed their men in that video praying. They had the name of Jesus literally on their lips as the camera was going by them. And so the wives were like, that was the proudest moment of my life. I'm so proud of my husband that he was considered worthy of this, of God, of sacrificing himself for the whole, the whole world can see this. And so again, just how to tell that story, visually in 10 minutes. That was the original goal, is 10 minutes, but yeah, it's 13 with credits now. So.
Wow. Yeah, no, there's certainly something heroic about it. I pondered, like, I have no interest in being martyred,
No,
but there's a small part of me that's a little bit like, I hate to say jealous that
right.
great is their reward in heaven,
Yes,
um,
that's for sure.
which is beautiful.
It is. I had the same conversation with their pastor basically in Egypt, and I told him the same thing. I said, I don't know if I would hope that I would have enough faith to go to go through that, but honestly, I don't know. And he said, well, if you can't die to self daily, probably not. If you can't die to the little things in your life that you're not supposed to be doing, your desires, that are ungodly, that are sinful, probably not. And that really hit me hard.
Yeah, it's convicting.
Yeah.
So you talked about going there and meeting with family members. How else might you prepare for this kind of a project?
Well, when I started, it was pretty clear early on that it was going to be inspired at least by iconography. And the Coptic Christians have a long tradition, thousands of years of iconography. So when I was in Egypt, I looked at some of the original second century images. And I tried, it was the same process as I'd used on Secret of Kells, really. And some of the things that Maurice Noble had taught me where I took in a lot of information. I wish I'd had more time to study more about iconography. But fortunately, there were a lot of amazing artists and iconographers that spoke into the project, that would look at my work. They would give feedback. And so at first it was just a matter of copying the images, and it didn't feel right. It felt like a photocopy of a photocopy, really. And so, yeah, just going through it, looking at their color, looking at their shape language, looking at the textures. You know, in a lot of iconography, they use the divine proportions, like golden section and dynamic symmetry. And I'd studied a little bit of that for, Maurice had talked to me about it way back. And I used it a little bit, but I didn't really dig in too deep until the Prodigal. And that's when I really began exploring. And then this was just like plussing that, because I actually had people speaking into what I was doing. So the divine symmetry, and then trying to apply that actually to the timeline of the film. So Mozart and Beethoven, for example, used, the golden section equation basically to help divide some of their songs. And that's what the rumor is anyway. And so I tried to do that with the film. And that point, that golden moment, is basically when we see Christ and the heavenly host above the martyrs on their knees with the ISIS behind them. So, and there's moments like that throughout the film. So I'm just trying to bring in that experience because I didn't grow up with icons. When I was, you know, in America, it as a Protestant, it's not a common thing. And so I thought it was actually idol worship. When I started talking to the iconographers, I realized that it was a form of worship actually in the creation. And they had, for each image, they were studying the Bible, and for each layer of paint, they would pray over it. Each color, like the gold, would represent the light of God. They were very intentional about the method they worked, and they used that as a way to draw closer to Christ. I didn't do that in my own work. Now I do, and it makes all the difference, as using my art as a form of worship, even if it's for a commercial or something like that. Just having that, I don't know, it's just part of that process that really spoke to me. And I think gives a lot of depth to the work that wasn't there before.
Yeah, even just looking at the frames, you can tell there's a lot there,
Yeah.
artistically and symbolically. Uh, is it coincidental that it also kind of looks like stained glass windows?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's some of the same shape language. And one of the other inspirations was, like, I don't know if you're familiar with precisionism or futurism. It was there were some art schools of art in the early 20th century where they were really celebrating the machine, and they were throwing away, it's Art Deco is similar, where they're throwing away very traditional things, traditional values, and embracing fascism, which is similar to what ISIS is doing. So I wanted to show a very shattered, broken world and because I think that's what the martyrs were experiencing, and that's the world that these ISIS guards live in. So I would intentionally break the planes. I would intentionally use reverse perspective. I would intentionally make some characters larger, just to give them more emphasis, even though it doesn't make sense, in real world perspective, anything. I mean, it's animation. But the balance with that was like, this is a real story. So you want enough realism there, that that you believe it, that you can relate to it without it being a cartoon, let's say. We had one, just a guy that he's a legend. This guy's amazing animator, and he was animating these beautiful shots on the film for me, but they were too caricaturized. They were very Disney, so they moved well, everything was great, but it felt too much like a caricature, as opposed to, so we tried to be really restrained with the movement, so that when these fantastic things happen, that contrast it would be a bigger contrast. You'd really feel those moments.
Hmm. Yeah, you had quite a number of artists working on this project from a number of different countries and
70
continents.
something artists. Yeah.
How do you how do you make sure that everything is kind of moving in a unified, quite unique and challenging?
It was like spinning plates. Yeah. We had a couple of production managers on it. My producer, Mandy Hart, she was dealing with a lot of that, but because a lot of the art was kind of donated. And what I mean by that is an artist might really want to work on the project for free, but they could only do a shot or two. And so, they would do their shots, and then we'd move on to another animator who'd draw the characters differently. And so we'd have to, yeah. And there were a couple of occasions where we had a few shots that were colored twice. We had a couple, it didn't happen often, but it did happen. And it was just one of those things that comes with remote work. You have to be really organized. And unfortunately, I'm not a very organized person. So It's my Achilles heel for sure. So we had the blessing of having these amazing artists because if we'd have been in a studio, we wouldn't have had access to all that. Um, you know, it just every person that was involved contributed something to the film that made it way beyond what I could have done on my own, for sure. Um, yeah, it
Huh.
was an amazing crew.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, given the stylistic limitations you've placed upon yourself by the approach that you took,
Mhm.
were there unique challenges and or um, unique strengths to this approach?
Yeah, for sure. I think the strengths were that we could work with, um, you know, I was working with artists in the Ukraine, during this war, during the war, you know, again, I couldn't have done that unless we were doing this remotely. So I had these great iconographers looking at stuff. They would look at the reels, they would give their thoughts, they would give their suggestions. Um, One of the lead animators, Bishoy Gendi, he's in the UK. He grew up Coptic. He's a Coptic Christian. Um, but it's just a weird thing. He had trained, he's an amazing animator, but he had trained in iconography as a young man. And so when he got on board, I didn't know any of this. And he would say, well, why don't you do this with the characters and stuff? And I was like, yeah, that's great. And so with his training, he brought in so much that I couldn't have. Joanna, she's in Sweden. Um, you know, she grew up in Syria, and this amazing she was one of my students in Denmark, and she brought in her experiences, and it just gave a level of detail that I couldn't have. It would have been impossible. Um, the the iconographers, Edmund Camel and his wife, again, I asked him to work on it because I liked his work. It turns out that he was the one that had done the icons in the Martyrs church.
Oh,
He knew
wow.
he knew the families. And so he was this gateway into interviewing some of the cousins that had been there the night that ISIS had kidnapped. One of the young men had, they had forced him to point out where his relatives were, the Christians, and he has to live with that now. But it's just, it's just heartbreaking. But I think God put all these people in place to make this happen. There's just no other way to explain it.
Yeah. Now you, from what I can tell, really specialize in color.
Yeah, that's one of the, yeah,
But as you are working with iconographers, color means something.
yes.
So, can you talk about striking a balance of using color as you know how in the medium of animation, but also having to use color in ways that you don't know how in iconography?
I'm sure I'm still going to get nicked by this, but the iconographers are going to like, well, it's okay. Because that's what happened. Nicolas Eric, he's in Germany now. Another guy, I think he grew up in Serbia, and he looked at my original sketches and he said, "Here." He handed me he'd made out this handmade palette of color. He goes, use this, because I was used to doing Nickelodeon stuff, and again, everything was screaming off. We want everything to have an attention and draw attention to itself. And his approach was much more subtle. Well, using natural materials for one thing. Um, and a lot of these guys were using egg tempera, which automatically has this gray level to it. So the control of saturation, especially, was something I really had to bring onto the project. And looking at it now, there's areas that I wish I had pulled back even more, just in context. But I guess that's true of any project you work on. So, but yeah, again, just these amazing people speaking into the film and the design. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Speaking of design, you use a lot of geometric shapes and principles.
Mhm.
Um, how do you avoid getting carried away when you are being so deliberate with the design and doing things specifically with it? Uh, I know you've talked about you can't get away from the life of the project, getting
Right.
caught up in all the principles. How do you how do you avoid that?
Well, I think honestly, for me, I ended up doing like one of the goals with this film was to become a better designer and to really it was a film that I wanted to design myself. I wasn't able to do it completely, but I probably maybe 80% of it is my design. Um, each shot I probably did 3 or 4 times, like 3 or 4 versions, because as I was learning, I mean, that was the great thing about having time. If it had been a regular production schedule, I wouldn't have had that luxury. But because of COVID, because of everything that happened over the last few years, I was able to like go in and revisit shots. As I was learning about iconography, the style became more graphic. Um, Originally, it was a lot more soft shapes, a lot more different use of color, different use of value. Seeing how things, especially as we started getting the edit together, being able to see how things worked. And my friend Moss, again, another great thing about time. He owns Red Moss Animation Studio in Thailand, and we worked together for quite a few years. And it's the first time I've had where I worked in the way that Chuck Jones and Maurice Noble worked, where I would do so I would write the script and then I would have a chance just to do images like concept art. Then I would give that to Moss. Moss would start, he would, put it into the storyboards. He'd start to build that. I'd see what he was doing. I would make sketches off of what he did. So there was a lot of back and forth just developing the story and making sure that it was very visual. And, that probably took a year at least. And then there were moments where I go, oh, we would find out a new piece of information. That was the other great thing about having time is that they would discover new information about what happened. They'd capture an ISIS guard, for example, and he would reveal new information that we didn't know. And so we would have to, as much as possible, try to add that back into the film and into the story. And so I'd say, "Hey, Moss, what are you doing this weekend?" And so we had this great relationship of going back and forth with things, which makes the film much more visual than it would have been if we'd have just gone through the traditional um, pipeline.
Yeah. Coming on up on time here. So I'll probably just ask one or two more questions, but
Sure.
what what's something you hope people who see this film take away?
Yeah, I the biggest thing is that I hope they come away with it with this feeling of contemplation that it makes them think about things about their own faith, perhaps, or we're so quick to judge, for example, and we're so quick in our society. Everything is really quick. And one of the things I learned about iconography, the purpose of an icon, is to really, it's a window into heaven. It's a window into the divine. And when you're looking at it and contemplating it, you stop and you think about things and you really reflect on yourself and your relationship to God. And I hope, my hope would be that at the end of the film, and my favorite part is the end, like after the film is done, and we know that they die, right, in the film. But after that moment, there's a moment where it's just the music and the blackness. And it's like, that's the moment where I would hope people would go, wow, what did I just see? And how do I fit into all of this? Because we're all connected, right? And to contemplate those things, even a little bit, that's the hope. And the real message that the families wanted to give is one of forgiveness, and just to show how crazy all this violence is. It's not really getting us anywhere. So it's a film about peace, I guess. A lot of, just from the trailer, there were a lot of feedback from Muslims actually, that they thought it was an anti-Muslim film, and they made it very clear that ISIS makes them look bad. They didn't support any of this. And so, it's not an anti-Muslim film. It's an anti-extremist film, really. And just reflecting on your relationship with God. And even if you aren't a believer, like reflecting on your place in the world, basically. Yeah. And how you fit into all of this craziness.
Yeah, no, it looks powerful. As I said, I'm looking forward to seeing it. Yeah, to the listening audience, I encourage you to go check it out. Also, I first heard of Tod through his book, The Noble Approach. This thing is a masterclass in color, in design. I've underlined so many things in this book, and I just go back to just to get good tips. Tod, this is a delight and honor. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you for having me. It's been great to meet you and talk with you a little bit.